This recording is protected by copyright. No part may be reproduced without the prior permission of the University of South Australia.
My name is Jacinta Thompson and I'm the Executive Director and Exhibitions and Events Producer for the Bob Hawke Prime Ministerial Centre. It is my pleasure to welcome you all here tonight on behalf of the Hawke Centre and the University of South Australia. In doing so, I take this opportunity to acknowledge that the University of South Australia is on the traditional country of the Kaurna people. We recognise and respect their cultural heritage, beliefs and relationship with the land, and we acknowledge that they are of continuing importance to the Kaurna people living today. Tonight, the Honourable Peter Malinauskas MP, the Labor member for Croydon, and the 47th Premier of South Australia will be in conversation with author and journalist George Megalogenis as they consider how to rekindle faith in our own democratic institutions. I warmly welcome the Premier and I welcome back George to the Hawke Centre. It's wonderful to have you back. We're thrilled to see so many people here tonight, and I would like to especially welcome the Honourable Dan Cregan MP, Special Minister for State, welcome. Colleagues from Department of the Premier and Cabinet, welcome. Mr Steen Jensen, Honorary Consul of Denmark. Dr Eva Pedersen, Honorary Consul of Belgium. Distinguished Professor Marnie Hughes-Warrington AO, Standing Acting Vice-Chancellor, Deputy Vice-Chancellor, Research and Enterprise, UniSA. Mr John Hood, welcome, Chancellor from Flinders University, and our Council members and Enterprise Leadership Team members from UniSA. The Hawke Centre is committed to delivering a diverse program of free events and exhibitions throughout the year, which reflect our fundamental themes of strengthening our democracy, valuing our diversity and building our future. To begin tonight's presentation, we will firstly hear from the Premier, who will then be joined on stage by George for, I'm sure, what will be a very insightful in-conversation. Please join me in a warm welcoming to our South Australian Premier, Peter Malinauskas.
Well, thank you, Jacinta Thompson, Executive Director of the Hawke Centre, for facilitating tonight's event. I would like to start by acknowledging that we're very fortunate to be getting together on the lands of the Kaurna people, and I would like to pay my respect to their elders past, present and emerging. To you, George, thanks for flying over today. I look forward to our chat. Having not seen the questions, I say that with a degree of trepidation. Can I also acknowledge Steen Jensen, Honorary Consul of Denmark, Eva Pedersen, the Honorary Consul of Belgium. Can I also thank John Hood for being here, Chancellor of the Flinders University. I'd like to acknowledge the Attorney-General of South Australia, the Honourable Kai Ma, who is not here tonight, who has played an important role in the work that we seek to talk to you about this evening. And I also want to particularly thank the Honourable Dan Cregan, the Minister for State, Special Minister of State, I should say, here in South Australia, as well as being the Minister for Police, Corrections and Emergency Services. Democracy is in a crisis of confidence. People need to wake up to it. Leaders need to respond to it. South Australia has a role to play in correcting it. There's an old joke, usually attributed to Winston Churchill, when he says that democracy is the worst form of government except for every other one. Unlike some of the quotes attributed to Churchill on the internet, he did actually say something like that. Although the full quote is somewhat different when it's read in its full context. Here's what he actually said in the House of Commons on the 11th of November 1947. It has been said that democracy is the worst form of government except all those other forms that have been tried from time to time. But there is a broad feeling in our country that the people should rule and that public opinion expressed by all constitutional means should shape, guide and control the actions of ministers who are their servants and not their masters. Churchill was not dismissive of democracy, nor did he just think it was the least worst option. In fact, he was saying that he shared the profound belief that people should be able to rule themselves with their government acting to serve them, not control them. Or to use my favourite quote, the words of US Supreme Court Justice Felix Frankfurter, in a democracy, the highest office is the office of citizen. It's a noble sentiment. That's easy to say, but one that has proved extraordinarily challenging to translate into a practical system of government. Many nations have tried with varying degrees of success, but admittedly, democracy remains a work in progress. Post-colonial Australia has never known any other system apart from democratic, responsible government. So it's especially easy for us to mistake it for being unremarkable, even inevitable. But of course, post-colonial Australia itself is only a blink of an eye when measured against the long millennia of different forms of rule over human society. Yet none of them come even close to what liberal democracy has achieved for humanity. Health, happiness, knowledge, prosperity. By any measure of standard of living you care to measure, all have enjoyed a period of unprecedented advancement under the umbrella of liberal democratic government. And yet, we live in a time when faith in democracy is at a particularly low ebb, especially among young people who feel they are being left behind by the very institutions that are supposed to serve them. The Centre for Future Democracy at the University of Cambridge recently published a study that combined data from close to 5 million respondents, that's hard to get your head around, in over 160 countries, which concluded that current millennials, those aged between 18 to 34 years old, are the first generation in living memory where the majority are dissatisfied with the way that democracy functions. Among the large democracies recording their highest ever level for democratic dissatisfaction were the United Kingdom, Brazil, Mexico, the United States and Australia. A Gallup poll in the US reported last month in The Economist shows a startling drop in voter trust in many of their institutions, honest elections, the judiciary, and even in the US, a drop in confidence in the armed forces. Only 20 years ago, Americans were brimming with confidence in their nation, easily beating the rest of the G7 in national pride. Today, they're at the bottom of that list. This isn't just alarming. It is a global emergency. However, relatively speaking, Australia is fortunate in having a robust and effective form of democracy, and that isn't just parochialism speaking. I say it in recognition of the countless Australians who have worked diligently to create and refine our singular form of parliamentary democracy. Ours is a unique system, informed by the British Parliament and the American Congress, yet one that I believe comes closer than either to achieving true democratic representation in the corridors of power. I will, however, admit an unapologetically large degree of parochialism in noting that South Australia has made an outsized contribution to our national democratic project. In 1854, a newly arrived 24-year-old Englishman named William Boothby was appointed the electoral officer for the fledgling colony of South Australia and given barely 2 years to prepare and conduct its first ever election under a new constitution. And it was a task he took on with a reformist zeal, abandoning most of the British system in favour of forming a public office to run the election, centralising the electoral rolls, and delivering the adoption of a globally leading secret ballot. Then Boothby single-handedly redesigned the ballot paper itself, instituting, for the first time anywhere in the world, pre-printed ballot papers with voters marking the cross within a square. It might not sound like a big idea. I'm trying to pump it up. But the truth was, this was a simple and effective innovation that is now standard for elections all over the planet. In 1861, the South Australian author, activist and polymath Catherine Helen Spence published A Plea for Pure Democracy. It was the beginning of her lifelong campaign for her state and then later her nation to adopt a preferential voting system under which representatives are not selected by the largest minority of voters, but because they have earned majority support from the electorate. In 1894, the tireless work of suffragettes like Spence, but also, of course, Mary Lee, resulted in South Australia proudly becoming the first jurisdiction to grant universal franchise to all adults and allow women to stand for Parliament, thereby ensuring that the subsequent Federation of Australia would be forced to follow the state's example and then the rest of the world. My reason for the history lesson is to show that our representative democracy is a living system, one that can and should and must be continually modified and improved to better serve the people it represents. But critically, South Australia can lead the charge. My government has a duty to continue this process of improvement. So today, I reveal the state government is working on a substantial, costly, monetarily, new policy to revitalise the way that civics is being taught in our schools. Our young people constitute the cradle of our democracy, and we need to get them engaged. We need to get them enthused. Civics education cannot be a dull, tick-a-box exercise. This is as important as English and maths. I have also established a brand new portfolio, that of Special Minister of State. The new ministry is responsible for all electoral and parliamentary matters, including reforms, with a keen eye on progress. I have very deliberately appointed an independent MP with whom I do not agree on everything to this new portfolio. And I've asked Minister Cregan to deploy his considerable intellect towards this cause with vigour. But I stand before you tonight to publicly release for the first time our draft legislation to reform the funding of elections in South Australia, specifically with regard to political donations. And when I say reform, allow me to be very clear. I am not talking about capping political donations, I'm not talking about limiting the number of donations or restricting where donations come from. Nor am I announcing a new transparency regime around electoral donations, because tonight I announce that we seek to ban all political donations, full stop. And we're not banning them from some people or some companies. We're banning them from everyone. I don't care if you're a cigarette company or a shoe store, whether you burn fossil fuels or you campaign against them, whether you're a business or you're a trade union. Political donations are out under the model I release tonight. So why are donations a problem? First, in my experience, the idea that any individual or company pays money in the expectation that it guarantees a particular policy outcomes is simply not true. The issue isn't that donations allow favours to be bought. The issue is that donations invite the perception that favours can be bought. And that sows the seeds of doubt, weakening public trust. But the bigger issue with donations is time and access. While buying a ticket to a political fundraiser can't provide a favoured policy outcome, what it does provide is access to elected officials. And there's nothing untoward about that, unless we have a situation where only people who buy tickets to fundraisers get access to elected officials. When you're in elected office as an MP, a minister or leader, you are inundated with requests for your time. People naturally want an opportunity to explain their problems, celebrate their successes, advocate solutions, generate interest in their ideas. They want to see their leaders interested in their concerns, as they well should. Now, my former EA is here tonight. I don't know, she's here somewhere. She'll down the back. There's Anne. Now, this is giving Anne heart palpitations watching this all over again. But this pile here, which I think achieves the dramatic effect I'm looking for, this is no kidding, and people can come and look at these, right? These are all FOIable, so and that happens. This is the meeting requests that have come to my office in the month. This is just the month of May. It doesn't include, because I asked this got to put together late as we're leaving this afternoon. This doesn't include all of the requests for my time in terms of from my electorate office. I'm the member for Croydon, so this has nothing to do with my duties as an MP. This is just the meeting request that came for the month of May. It doesn't include all of the other meetings of government. So this doesn't include meetings with department CEOs, officials, briefings from government. This doesn't include cabinet. This doesn't include cabinet subcommittees, the pre-brief with cabinet, emergency management committee meetings. None of that is in here. This doesn't include meeting requests that I have from MPs. This doesn't include just the day-to-day job. This is just requests for one's time. None of this should be surprising, right? So ministers and MPs have busy jobs, but this is routine, just to have that bigger request on your time. The point I seek to demonstrate is that when you are in elected office, time is the most precious and finite of resources. And in the endless war of attrition that is an election campaign, where having a healthy war chest can be the difference between winning and losing, implementing your policies or not, politicians are inevitably forced to make a calculation between the time they can spend speaking to constituents and the time they must spend raising funds by holding events and meeting donors. And if you want to see what the extreme of this looks like in practice, you need only look at the United States. In the US, author Martin Schramm's book, Speaking Freely, former Democratic Representative Bob Edgar admitted that during an election, 80% of his time, so this is a quote, 80% of my time, 80% of my staff's time, 80% of my events and meetings were fundraisers. It sounds insane. Well, guess what? Edgar left the US House of Representatives in 1987, and Schramm's book came out in 1995, 15 years before the Citizens United decision in which the US Supreme Court removed almost all barriers to political donations from corporations and organisations. It was calculated in 2021, out of an election cycle, sitting, not candidates, sitting congressional representatives were spending on average 30 or more hours every week ringing for donations in Democratic and Republican call centres. Now just think about that for a moment. That's time that's not being spent doing your meetings, working on policy, making laws, debating an issue, holding town hall meetings. That's time spent on the phones, hours out of every single day, exclusively focused on raising campaign money. And they have to do it because when the polls suggest a close contest, no candidate can afford to concede any advantage whatsoever, whether that's on ad spend, whether it's on merchandising, whether it's on getting the very best campaign managers who, by the way, refuse to work for candidates that aren't willing to sign agreements committing no less than 80 to 85% of their time fundraising. The US election in 2020 cost $14.4 billion. It blew all records out of the water for the 2016 election. The next election, this November, is set to demolish the $14.4 billion record. Even smaller contests have a ridiculous price tag now. Last month, you could Google this one, it's a mind-blowing. Last month, the runoff election for the US Texas House District 21 became the most expensive in the state's and the US's history, with over $7 million spent by the candidates. That's more than entire campaigns cost in Australia. And it wasn't even a fight between the Democrats and the Republicans. This was a Republican primary. $7 million on a state legislature Republican primary. Now think about why people in the United States feel so disconnected from their political representatives. It's because they're not representatives. They're professional telemarketers. The only chance you have of hearing from your local MP is if you find yourself on a donor list and they call you asking for your money. At this level of absurdity, it is not just an issue of access, it does become an issue of influence. We can't have democracy where the power of your ideas for the nation matter less than the appeal of your ideas to wealthy donors. Of course, Australia hasn't got anywhere near the level of the American political industrial complex. But we can't ignore the way that today's American political flashpoint regularly becomes tomorrow's Australian political tactic. Now, let me speak frankly. We are a relatively new government. We're doing pretty well at fundraising at the moment. We handed down our budget on Thursday. On Friday, we had the state progressive business lunch, progressive business being the fundraising arm of the Labor Party. It was the biggest, most well-attended one we ever had. And that reflects the enormous benefit of incumbency. It's a lot easier to sell tickets to hear what the government of the day is doing than sell tickets to hear what a would-be government might do. There is no shortage of people at all, of people in my own show who have pointed out that this election reform is contrary to my own government's interests. And they are right. But I submit to the Labor Party that putting people, not donations, at the centre of the political process is always good for working people. This week, South Australia lost its 36th Premier. It took a Liberal Premier in Still Hall to finally abolish an undemocratic gerrymander, a reform to which many attribute Don Dunstan's rise. For me, that analysis is too simple. Still Hall's electoral reform didn't hand Labor government. It simply levelled the playing field. This is to Still Hall's eternal credit, because no true leader, no true competitor should ever fear a level playing field. But more than this, a donation-dominated democracy isn't just unfair because it's an effective gerrymander for the incumbent. It's also unfair because it's an effective gerrymander for people of means over and above those who don't have the luxury of donating their hard-earned money to political campaigns. Beyond the power of political self-interest, there is another reason why banning donations hasn't been seriously pursued to date. It's because, however virtuous the intent, the execution of such reform is fiendishly complicated. That's for two reasons. The first is new entrants and their access to democracy, and the second is the High Court. Let me start with the first. Election campaigns cost money. If we're not raising that money through fundraising, it necessarily must come from somewhere else. The purest source, of course, is through public funding. Public funding regimes already exist in all Australian parliaments, including South Australia. The funding is allocated on the size of your vote. That seems rational, that seems fair. But without fundraising, such a system would put new entrants at an immediate disadvantage. Now, as one of two parties of government, I admit that I'm not looking to sing the virtues of new entrants, nor do I have a particular interest in propping up minor parties and independents. But any failure to ensure that they have access to the process would obviously be undemocratic in its nature, would be pulling the ladder up behind us. So in the development of a new scheme, we must ensure that the funding model is fair, rational and reflective of community support, but at the same time not create onerous barriers to entry for new groups and candidates who may lack the resources of more established parties. Managing that sort of balance is a high wire act that would challenge any acrobat. It means putting spending caps in place to end the war of attrition. It means public funding up to the spending cap. It means designing the laws to welcome new entrants. The objective is to enhance our democracy, not to diminish it. I said the second reason the execution is hard is the High Court. In a nutshell, it has been determined by the High Court that the act of making a political donation is a form of political communication. And the High Court has ruled in multiple decisions over the last 30 years that the freedom of political communication is an implied right within the Constitution. So I want to be candid about the fact that while we've taken the best advice available to us, any legislation could be sorely tested. It would be foolhardy of me or any legal expert to predict the outcome of any such test. And if it is ultimately doomed to fail, I know that a lot of political hardheads, even in my own party organisation, will breathe a mighty sigh of relief. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't give this a red-hot try, despite the difficulties. Because what if we succeed? What if we can create an election funding model without donations? One proving that this not only should be done, but it can be done. That would be a global democratic innovation up there with the secret ballot and an X in a box. The democratic project demands diligence. It requires attention. Apathy is its Achilles heel. The more disconnected that politics becomes from people themselves, the more fragile the institution of democracy itself becomes. We cannot shirk our responsibility. It would be an indictment on all of us to assume that all responsibility of democratic reform only belonged to our forefathers and mothers. It is a preposterous idea that only generations past are the ones who had to campaign, who had to protest, who had to fight, who even had to die in the name of democracy. While the rest of us, alive today, we can just sit back and watch another episode of Temptation Island or Farmer Wants a Wife. On the weekend, the EU elections confirmed that the European project is now officially ailing, with nationalists and the far right on the march. Meanwhile, only a few hundred kilometres away from Brussels, there is a literal war in continental Europe between autocracy and democracy. In South Africa, Mandela's dream of democracy at the heart of a rainbow nation has turned into a corrupt nightmare. In Hong Kong, one country, two systems has rapidly devolved into a democracy demolition derby. And in the US, the contest for the leadership of the free world is now a choice between octogenarians. Democracy is in a crisis of confidence. People need to wake up to it. Leaders need to respond to it. And South Australia can play a role in correcting it. We have a duty, we have a responsibility, and we have an opportunity before us to take the great project of democracy forward, as the people of our state have done so many times before. And with this we can say, hand on heart, that we've done our bit in preserving the global democratic ideal, that we've done our part to give our children and our grandchildren the best chance of walking into that ballot box, believing and knowing that their vote is worth something, that their vote is a precious gift worthy of the sacrifice made by countless others so that they can chart their own course, choose their own future, determine their own destiny. That's always been worth fighting for, and I hope you agree.
Thank you for introducing us, Jacinta, and Premier, thank you for that presentation. I know we've got media in the room tonight, so that is a scoop of national significance, I think we could say. Whether it works out or not, you've already flagged some of your, well, concerns is probably not the right word, but maybe apprehensions about whether the thing could get up or not. Could I begin with a two-part question? This is usually how we do it at the press club. The journo goes on a 20-minute rant. But the two parts to it is, this is obviously something that means a lot to you. Maybe give the audience and the 400 or so people who are obviously watching this on live stream as well, an idea of how long you've held this particular view and the why now. Maybe elaborate on the why now, because I think you flagged that your political interest would have been, if you were to do this at all, would probably be do later in the life of a government where you could set the ground rules for a future Labor opposition to sort of enjoy the spoils of a level playing field after you lose. At the beginning, with quite a healthy majority, and you've knocked off a government in a single term, wouldn't be the ideal time to do it politically, which you've mentioned before. But maybe begin with the passion project. How long have you been thinking about this?
I feel very fortunate that I've had the chance to travel to the US a lot over the years, and I got the opportunity to study there in 2008, and I started to familiarise myself in a pretty detailed way with their election tactics and the political process. And I met some of these campaign managers, and they told me, the good ones, the higher the winning record of the campaign manager, the higher the demands are of fundraising on candidates. Because the best campaign managers know that the single biggest variable to determine the likelihood of success in a ballot box is how much money they've got at their disposal to weaponise against their opponents. And, I was affronted by this. I really was. And then not too long after that, I had the great privilege of getting to lead a trade union in South Australia, the largest trade union in the state. And we're one of the biggest donors to the Labor Party. And at the time, and the union still is. And while that I could easily rationalise that in the context of everything, I felt then that I had to be willing to speak up about it. So I wrote an opinion piece, and it ran on the front page of the Tiser in 2012, I think, or thereabouts. Yep. And I put the marker in the ground. Then I became leader of the opposition, and I thought, we debated this in shadow cabinet about whether or not it be election policy. It was robust, but you've got to have a few things you're willing to put the stake in the ground on. Otherwise, it's hard to, you ask yourself why you would live this crazy business that is politics, and that was one of them. And I said to them, I said, look, we're going to have to commit to this in opposition. And people said, oh, just wait till after the election and then you can do it, right? Which is the easiest thing to do in opposition. Every time you announce a policy, you worry about the blowback. And anyway, but I knew that we had to announce it then, because otherwise you get into government and then the temptation takes hold just to, we'll do it after another election, and then it just never happens. So we committed to it in opposition, which boxed us in, and we've been working on ever since. So in terms of why now, it's because we committed to it, and by having committed to it, you've got to make it happen.
Do you expect first thing tomorrow morning, or even now, your phone lighting up of all those people who paid for that progressive lunch the other day, wanting their money back?
Well, they can't, so...
What's done is done, right? Sorry about that. It's a very serious topic, and we will go to the entrails before we go to other issues. Have you told the Prime Minister?
Yes, we've. Look, we have made it clear to both the Special Minister of State, the Prime Minister knows about this because we have committed to it. This has been our policy for a while. It has taken us a long time to get to this point. Like drafting legislation, as Minister will tell you, and Kai and Ma before that, this is really complicated when you get into the detail. But yes, and also the Prime Minister's here tomorrow.
Yep.
So we wanted to I want to let the Prime Minister's office know, oh, by the way, I think he's still coming. So,
but in terms of their approach, because they're obviously looking at it, and they seem to be umming and ahhing between a sort of duopoly model that sort of Peter Dutton and the opposition will agree to versus one that doesn't squish the teals. Yeah. And there seems to be a different calculus for the federal government because they've only got a 2-seat majority versus yourself. But do you want to how will I put this as a question? I don't want you to necessarily blow up what they're doing, but can you see what they're trying to do versus what you're doing and maybe do a compare?
Their model is different. Their model is different. I can't say I'm across the detail of their model in the same way I'm at ours, obviously, but I just think if you're going to do it properly, right? And, we've got all these, at the moment, any of you could donate unlimited funds more or less in the political process, and it gets disclosed well later down the track. Like I think that you might remember, George, but you can make a donation and it doesn't become publicly disclosed depending on the timing of you make that donation. It was sometimes 18 months after the fact, which you couldn't put your hand in your heart and say that's particularly transparent. So I think if you're going to do it properly, and I keep coming back to the point I was trying to demonstrate in the speech, is that every time that a politician dedicates time and effort to raising money for themselves, it feels at odds with the whole reason why you're not attracted to get into politics to raise money for you. You're attracted to get into politics because you want to do things for other people. And that's true for everybody that gets into the business. I say that of my political opponents very comfortably. That's where people's motivations are. But you have to fundraise in order to be able to get there and implement your plan, your program. So it just feels like this necessary draw on your time that runs contrary to what people want us to be doing. And I don't know how that's healthy. Now, there's a cost to public funding. That's the catch.
Yeah.
And someone will say, oh, great, we're giving more money to political parties. Well, yes. But what price democracy? I hope that there is enough rejection in the electorate of money in politics for them to believe and appreciate that this is a worthwhile investment on their part, consistent with their interests.
Yeah, and public funding is a form of insurance anyway. Now, we were talking earlier about great South Australian legacies, especially from the 19th century. On the other side of the balance sheet, sort of each political culture has its dark side. One of them is obviously, which you alluded to before, which is the Playford gerrymander. And in fact, I think he was Premier for 26 years, so even outlasted Joe and outlasted the entire federal coalition from 1949 to 72. But the other one I'm thinking of is a guy who started a newspaper here when he was a young child. Name escapes me. But an interesting thing about Murdoch, and I've been trying to find this quote and I can't find it. To anyone out there in the social media sphere, if you can find this quote, it's worth digging out. His first contact with the US system before Fox became this sort of souped up political machine was that he thought public funding. So he came with Australian goggles, took one look at the US system, and he thought public funding of their election system was probably good insurance for their democracy because he saw the supersizing, he saw where it was going to go. Yeah. Then he figured out he could make a buck from it and it didn't matter to him. I'm using Murdoch as a bit of a segue to what some of the influence vacuums that your policy might create that might get filled elsewhere. So think about you're taking the trade unions out of the moneyed relationship with the Labor Party, which is a historic break. This is not the break that an editorial writer at The Australian would say, fewer delegates at state and national conferences. This is just removing the connection. But you're not trying to undermine memberships of political parties. So you've got a cap in there. Maybe just explain to the audience what
Look, the union question is a really important one, and naturally one that we have grappled with. And there are, again, I'm happy to speak plainly about this. There are trade union leaders who are opposed to what we're seeking to do here. But I submit this to them. The trade unions don't have influence over the Labor Party because of money. And if they do, they shouldn't. Trade unions should have influence over the Labor Party through the vehicle of the party itself, members and delegates they have at conferences, right? So I'm not seeking to unwind any of that. That's been done, and that should stand the test of time. I'm talking about, every time I mention unions, Dan goes running out of the room. It's just like cabinet now.
Sprung.
No, he's got one of these up in the hills with his constituents. The power dynamic of the trade union movement within the Labor Party can be preserved through affiliations and so forth. What I'm seeking to do is break the nexus of money.
Yep.
And I think there's a distinction between the two. And as has always been the case with the trade union movement within the Labor Party, I think they're an important ballast within the Labor Party at its best. And on occasion it creates points of difference. But that's healthy, and then ultimately the power of one's argument should be what wins the day.
Now they could, in the next few years, your government might have an industrial relations issue, workplace issue. There might be a particular issue about an industry that's in trouble, and then they can. This is where the first of the influence vacuums that my quick read of this might identify is that they think, well, I'm not going to be funding a political party. We could fund our own campaign against the government. So you can't stop. If there isn't a political party attached to the money, say a public campaign like the miners against the mineral resources rent tax in 2010, or if Clive Palmer decided to ditch his party but was still run $100 million worth of ads in an election campaign, how do you think your way out of that particular problem?
This is the big problem. Okay, so the legislation which is going up online tonight, we put out to public consultation for the next month. Our objective is to get the legislation into the Parliament this sitting year, just after the winter break. The legislation as it currently is drafted does not contemplate the regulation of third-party campaigns, principally because it is really hard constitutionally. For the reasons I talked about, but that's a problem we've got now. I mean, if an industry group or has a particular beef with, or industry group or a trade union or anyone else has a beef with my government's policy, they can run a campaign on TV now as they can during the course of the election campaign. So we're not really changing anything there. Yeah. So I simply say that yes, while it runs the risk that might grow, I would say that risk exists in any event. So let's just focus on what we can legitimately control. Now, during the course of the consultation, if there is a vehicle or mechanism to provide a framework of regulation around third-party campaigns, then we are open to facilitate that in the drafting of the legislation. But as it currently stands, we've quite deliberately left it open, because I think that creates another level of complexity, one we're not averse to, but one that we need to be really careful about.
And on, this is a related issue, but on third parties, you're introducing a cap, you're not stopping them from raising funds for a political campaign, because you can't publicly fund someone without a vote.
This is for independents.
Yeah, for independents, not third parties. So for independents, so...
New entrants.
I think the phrase is, essentially new entrants to the political market. There's no barrier to entry for someone to form a political party or for an independent to run. Yes. And in that instance, they can be funded. So, up to a cap, subject to a cap.
Correct. So basically what we're doing, there is an existing cap, right, which applied in the 2022 state election. That cap is over $5 million. we are reducing, so the South Australian Labor Party or the Liberal Party or any other party for that matter can only spend up to, at the 2026 state election, can only spend up to a bit over $5 million. We are reducing that figure from 5 million to 4 million. And then we're the public funding that exists today is increased up to the cap, in simple terms. For new entrants, so for the George Megalogenis party or independent, hopefully not in Croydon, we are saying that if you fill the nomination criteria, get the requisite number of signatures and so forth, then up front we're going to pay you some money.
Yep.
So you can campaign against me. Starting to get nervous about this. And then so you can campaign, and then you'll be eligible to get public funding on the basis of your vote, as per the usual regime. But we are also in the draft out for consultation, we are also facilitating the maintenance of your ability to fundraise to try and as a new entrant. But if you get elected, the game's up.
The game's up, yeah. You become a registered party for purposes of the Act. Yeah.
And the proposition is that you can only fundraise up on small donations rather than the big, massive $50,000 donations. There's a $2,700 cap is what's been proposed on an individual donation, which is consistent to what has been found to be constitutional in New South Wales.
Yeah. So, again, I'm getting into the weeds here, but I'm looking at some of the influence vacuums. I'm sort of testing the proposition. What would stop either of the main parties from running phony third-party candidates?
You're on to me. I shouldn't go, especially with these guys up here. So let me understand your question.
Well, there does seem to be incentive, especially for a bad faith party. It doesn't necessarily have to be the Labor or Liberal this time around, but it may be a few years from now if a party gets sick of losing, that they start to game some marginal seats with third party, their own people as independents who in the event of a hung parliament, they could get them over the line and make a minority government. So how do you stop somebody, a whole lot of people just turning up at once in a number of seats? Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah. So there was a concern that you would industrialise new entrants because we're paying them cash up front.
Yeah.
So what the model has done, and I'm looking at one of my officials to make sure I've got this right, is we are creating a pool of funds that those people then get access to, which then deprives the ability in an organised way from a nefarious political operator or otherwise to try and industrialise nominations of new entrants with the explicit objective of making money and causing mayhem.
Yeah.
So there would be a diminishing return for people who would seek to do that.
Because at the last, it didn't affect South Australia so much, but at the last federal election we saw that till phenomena had a multiplier effect, and Liberal people will tell you that it's very difficult to get boots on the ground in an individual seat, it's a once safe seat of theirs, where the Teal candidate has essentially 1,000 volunteers and about $1 million in the fundraising. A major political party cannot, especially if you're stretched across 6 or 7 seats, you do the math really quickly. You're already above what you would spend for an entire election campaign against 5, 6, 7, 8 independents.
So it isn't just that statewide cap of $4 million we're putting in place, but we're putting in place individual seat caps as well.
Yeah.
So that it's not just about having a level playing field between the Liberal and the Labor Party at a state level. You want to have an level playing field between any individual candidate at a local level. And this is where this might all sound very dry, but it's actually really important. It's really important in the likelihood of success in the High Court if it is tested. But it's also, this proposition is going to get scrutiny, as it absolutely should. It actually has to be sincere in terms of the integrity of the maintenance of democracy and the objective of levelling the playing field. I think most of the electorate who are paying attention to this, and I hope that's as many people as possible, clearly, the founding principle we're shooting for is a level playing field, where it's the power of your ideas, the power of your policy that wins the day, and rather than the amount of money you've got in the campaign fund.
Yeah, and you mentioned in your speech, go more general question now, but you mentioned in your speech collapse in trust. Do you see this? Do you see money as one of the causes for the collapse in trust, or because it's a global phenomenon?
I think it contributes to it, absolutely, yes.
And so what does the system look like when it's working ideally, and how would you benchmark a recovery in trust?
The big one that worries me is apathy, right? I think if there's an appreciation in the electorate that the system is trustworthy, then there is a greater propensity to engage with the system, to think about it. All of the other nonsense that goes on in politics is sort of the cost of doing business. And it's always been, democracy's always had its sort of rough edges. And you can account for that, you can rationalise it. What I struggle with is when people actively choose to disengage. It does irritate me, and I try not to let things irritate me too much into the work, but the thing that does irritate me is when you get people, they're all corrupt, they're all, selfish bastards, politicians, this mentality. And what frustrates me about that isn't that it's a reflection, arguably, on those of us who are in the job. It's a reflection of what they think the system represents, a lack of trust in the system. And I worry that we've transcended it. We've crossed a threshold. There's always been cynicism in democracies towards politics and politicians. That's part of the fabric. That's healthy, right? We want that. That's necessary. But we cross a threshold when cynicism becomes an excuse for political apathy and laziness, political disinterest. Sometimes it's easier just to say, they're all, it doesn't mean anything, it doesn't count for anything. Once you start to believe that, then you excuse yourself from having to read the paper and think about what the issues are. And that's a sort of that's an abdication of civic responsibility, which I don't think we should say I don't think we should allow that. I guess that's, if we see, if anything is done to change our democracy, to see a diminished appetite for that attitude and a greater appetite to say, I'm going to just think about what the issues are for a moment before I cast my ballot. That's what success looks like. That's where we want to be. Now, that's not easy, of course. Yeah. And I'm not naive enough to believe that getting rid of donations gets us there, but it can't hurt.
Yeah. And in a sense, you're signalling in the immediate sense, but hopefully the idea permeates over a number of years that if my time isn't bought, then my time is available to you, to an individual citizen.
Absolutely.
Yep. Yeah. Can I talk more generally about trust? And I might just reflect as a journalist, because I was in the press gallery from the 80s through to the 90s to the turn of the 21st century before I went back to the Melbourne Bureau for the Australian. And it was a common thought in the 90s that there was a lot of cynicism around in the electorate. And when Pauline Hanson came, she sort of lit a fuse. The system was tinder dry for someone like that to turn up. But when I look back at the data, being a data nerd, trust in politics and trust in government and trust in democracy was actually pretty high all the way through the 90s. And it wasn't too bad in the early part of the 90s in the federal system. And it peaks in 2007. And the big switch for us was Kevin Rudd walking away from his emissions trading scheme, and then the revolving door at federal level. Now, take me back to that time when you were on the way up. Do you think that because I know our numbers now line up with the rest of the world. The rest of the world seems to be having the same brain snap at the same time. But there was a very specific local condition that saw trust fall through the floor in the Australian system. Do you want to reflect on that particular period? And do you think that is that something that's almost impossible to retrieve once it's happened?
I'm happy to reflect on it reluctantly. I think a few things happened at the same time around that, Mark. I wouldn't discount the role that the GFC played.
Yep.
The reason why I say that is because the GFC represented a threshold moment where we saw, global economic recession, which, yes, was largely avoided in Australia. But we saw global economic recession as a result of negligence on behalf of many people running financial institutions. And the people that paid the price was largely working people. And then there was a sense that this would result in a period of change. Then we came out of the back of the GFC and we saw economic inequality accelerate. Mm-hmm. And I think it's the confluence of events that have occurred post the GFC that has contributed towards, I guess, the political instability we've seen ever since then, but really start to crystallise, 2015 onwards, probably even earlier, 2014 onwards. Economic inequality is a very, insidious form of destabilisation in a sense of society. And I think that really contributed frustration towards the political orthodoxy. Well, that hasn't worked, so what's different? And when someone comes along with simple message that clearly is very different, then people might start to form the judgment, well, why not try something else? Now, and then if you layer upon that, I think on occasions a reckless response from mainstream leaders in how to deal with that and some of the language that is used, I think that only fuels the sense of frustration. I think the best example of that was, the unfortunate use of words by Hillary Clinton as referring to people as a basket of deplorables.
Yep.
Think about your own lived experience. We all have debates and arguments with people that we love and that we care about, friends, family on occasions. Let's assume that you're having a debate that's got a bit of heat in it, right? You have an argument that's good-natured, but let's assume you're having a bit of a dispute that's, got you a bit razzed up. Have you ever won one of those arguments by, or persuaded anyone of your point of view, by calling the person that you're arguing with a name, or patronising them, or demonstrating a complete unwillingness to try and understand their perspective? It rarely works, if it ever does. So I think we've just seen a whole confluence of events that have been problematic. To answer your question, George, do I think the revolving door of political leadership that we saw in Australia, that basically, the last Australian Prime Minister to be re-elected in this country was John Howard in 2004.
That's right.
That was 20 years ago. It was 20 years ago the last time this country re-elected a Prime Minister, mainly because political parties have deprived the electorate the option of re-electing a Prime Minister. Do I think that has contributed towards the malaise, towards the body politic amongst the community? Yes, undoubtedly. But like I said, I wouldn't discount, in terms of the rise of populism that we've seen, the role that the GFC played as a really seminal moment in that. Now, it's hard to know where it goes from here. I don't want to take too much time, but the UK election is going to be different. It's going to be interesting. That looks like it's heading a particular way. Does that represent a line in the sand moment where British politics moves beyond, the brash, bold, populist type leader, best represented by both Corbyn on the left and Boris Johnson on the right? And now do we go back to a more sort of thoughtful contribution towards the political discourse? I don't know.
Yeah, you wonder in their particular case, though, whether their problems are too big to resolve now.
Time will
So it might not be 1983 as it was for us.
Correct.
Yeah. There is, I assume there are a couple of Greeks in the audience, or Greek heritage. The people in Europe nominate the Greek system as the one that's course-correcting, because it was the one that the two-party system broke about 2011 when the PASOK party was wiped out, and then a hard left party took over, and the sort of centre-right party's primary vote collapsed, and then they went through a few rolling crises with the sovereign debt crisis. And I think, at least on the centre-right side of politics, their politics has normalised a bit, and they had one of the best COVID performances a couple of years ago. But you never want to put any system through what they went through. But a lot of people in Europe do look to Greece as a possible correction, having done 10 years of populism.
Well, who knows? Most people would assume that I'm familiar with Greek politics.
No, I'm assuming there are a couple of people in the audience. I'm not assuming you are.
I wish I was.
Yeah.
Malinauskas is Lithuanian. Just
no, I wasn't making that.
I know. I'm not just.
And Megalogenis is not Lithuanian either.
No. In my electorate, which I'm very fond of, I've got a big Greek community, and I always feel like I'm letting them down when I tell them I'm not Greek. They're good people. It's going to be really interesting from my perspective to see how the French parliamentary elections go that were called on the weekend.
Yeah.
Clearly a very bold move on behalf of Macron, and it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out. I think that'll be an interesting litmus test about where mainstream Europe is at. But Germany is the other place at the moment where we're starting to see an extraordinary fervour on the far right in a way that hasn't been seen in German politics for a very long period of time. It's hard to know how that plays out.
And you alluded to Ukraine earlier. It defies my corporate memory to see a situation where there'll be parties in Europe seeking mandates to let Russia win. That's the upshot of the hard right on the continent.
And then the consequence of that, institutionally, across Europe, starts to become rather concerning, more than it already is. And then, of course, November is going to be so critical in terms of what NATO looks like into the future, and that's hard to predict, even if Trump wins. So,
by the way, we've just set an all-time record for a political discussion. Trump did not get mentioned till overtime.
Well, there we go.
10 past 7.
Sorry, I broke our run there, George.
I don't know, you did well because you...
But look, I mean, we do live in the most extraordinary of times. Now, I don't know, and you'd be able to comment on this with more authority than maybe myself, George, but maybe every election feels like it's the most important that history's ever seen and so forth. But we do live at a really interesting moment in time, and either what we're seeing is going to be flushed out and there'll be a recalibration, or the opposite, and we go from a rolling period of instability in politics. The one thing that I invite people just to contemplate when you think about that question, and I'm inclined to be a little bit optimistic, but is what, notwithstanding my reference to the GFC earlier, so many of the forces that seem to exist in politics, in liberal democracies globally at the moment, aren't too inconsistent to the sort of things that we saw in a very dark period in the 1930s. What people, of course, what was different then was we had the Great Depression. I would hate to have a Great Depression now.
Yeah.
Now, I'm not anticipating one, and I think we could have a degree of high degree of confidence that's not going to happen. I'm not seeking to be catastrophise in any way, but you would hate to see a really, really substantial economic shock that had a particularly nefarious impact on a large number of people in the current political climate. That would be very unfortunate indeed. But I'm inclined just to be a little bit optimistic about where we're heading, notwithstanding whatever happens in November in the US, for a range of reasons, principally because, I don't know, it's hard not to have faith in people wanting the best for families in their communities. Like, principally, everybody wants that.
Yeah.
And if that motivation is what informs how people vote, then I think we can be confident that it's going to be okay. That's the reason why I'm a bit optimistic.
Yeah. I'm almost tempted to add something on Trump, but I might leave it, if we do have a bit of time, I might leave it to later. When you're reflecting on the GFC, and I think you're right when you sort of bring, there was sort of meltdown with Australian characteristics in terms of the revolving door, but every first world democracy hit a similar crisis of confidence after the GFC. The pandemic was an interesting one for me because it felt like we were repeating, whereas Kevin Rudd told us in 2008 to go shopping in the national interest, Prime Minister, Premiers and Chief Ministers told us all to stay at home in the national interest, kind of reverse transaction. You were paid not to go out and shop, you were paid to not shop or only shop once a day. Trusted all institutions, but the states.
Yes.
The states overshot, and the Federation looked a very interesting beast at that point. And I think certainly 2020, maybe into 2021, until Sydney started sending the virus all over Australia, if I'm allowed to be parochial for a split second, it felt like we were pretty happy constituents for that year of the crisis, not dissimilar to the way I think Australia felt briefly during the GFC. But I think we've come out of COVID in a not dissimilar way, with some of those problems that are identified through the pandemic not easily resolvable. Now, this is a sort of tail off of a question in two parts. You took a particular approach in opposition to not contest everything that Premier Marshall did, and you made them a one-term government. A couple of your Labor colleagues went hard from the beginning and didn't make it to the election. Coming out of that, been able to configure a way to win in a time which is really pro-incumbent. Certainly that first year and a bit of the pandemic is very, very pro-incumbent. To be able to take power in those circumstances, does it feel like the South Australian constituency is as obedience is the wrong word, willing to be led as they might have been in 2020? Sorry, I did save the trickiest one for last.
The pandemic presented a really unique set of circumstances, and we were all genuinely fearful about what this was going to mean to our health. People don't even think we're worried about their own health. They're worried about the health of their parents, their spouses, their children. So people were really craving strong leadership at the time, and looking to their institutions to exercise good judgment. And I think largely we saw that around the country, including by my predecessor and all the officials that he worked with. And that's to everyone's great credit. And I was happy to sort of say that at the time. My judgment was, look, this crisis is out of the box, for all of us in our lifetimes. And what I said to my parliamentary team was, you've got to think of this like a bushfire. When there's a bushfire, no one wants oppositions out there hopping into the government about how to put the fire out. Like, how does that help anybody? I didn't know the bushfire was going to last 18 months, but but other opposition leaders were out there, smashing every day. And I think most people were like, what? My view was and remains that, if whatever the situation with the pandemic come the state election was, people if we were able to demonstrate a genuine commitment towards science-based policy, then that isn't a point of difference at the election. It doesn't matter who you vote for. The state libs here were really strong. They followed the science, which is exactly what you want people to do, and we were going to do the same thing. So that wasn't a point of difference. What I wanted to demonstrate was the point of difference was what do we see the pandemic as a moment to recalibrate the future of the state, to use it as a platform for a bit more of an ambitious policy about the future, so that the legacy of the pandemic isn't just a bad memory. It's something a bit more hopeful and optimistic about the future. I got a book got given to me during the pandemic called Citizen Clem, about Clem Attlee and his approach in terms of reconstruction post World War II in the UK. That was informed my judgments. Now, but the pandemic presented such a unique set of circumstances in terms of people's, almost unprecedented appetite for strong intervention from government in their lives. That was temporary by nature. In a way, that's probably a good thing.
Yep.
So now I think we're well and truly back to a far more contested political environment. I wouldn't mind going back to that now in this job, but that's healthy. In terms of are the electorate willing to be led, I think ultimately yes, but that doesn't mean. I think people want. I don't know, but my assessment is I think people do look for strength in leadership on a number of things, particularly where you have a sense of conviction. On other occasions, people look for their political leaders to be more empathetic and open-minded to compromise and change in position. And I think it really depends on the issue. But more than anything else, I think the electorate craves a bit of vision, accompanied by a degree of authenticity about the way you're willing to go about pursuing it. And no leader will ever pass a perfect test in the pursuit of that, because it's everyone's infallible, but just got to give it your best shot, I guess.
We were trying to work out whether it was possible to rope this joke in as we were thanking the Premier and the audience, both here and the live stream. It's the 60th anniversary of the Beatles coming to town. And as I observe both this audience and the digital space, because I could see all the people watching, theoretically, this is the first full house since that day, apparently, in South Australia. So, thank you to the Premier, but also thank you to the audience. It's been a very engaged conversation.
I just want to thank you. The apathy point is the frustrating one from my perspective, but when people take time out on a June winter's night to come and hear about a policy, I can't tell you how much we appreciate your interest and your enthusiasm for what the future of our democracy might look like. So I can't say thank you enough for... when I got told that this many people were coming tonight, I was really quite taken aback. So thanks, Jacinda, and thanks everyone for coming. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.